The battlefield had long been declared silent, yet the ground still carried the memory of every scream, every hurried step, every life that had crossed it in desperation. Private Daniel Hargreaves walked slowly through the overgrown terrain, his boots sinking slightly into soil softened by years of rain and neglect. Grass had begun to reclaim the scars of war, but the air still felt heavy, as if the land itself refused to forget what it had witnessed. As he moved past a collapsed trench line, something pale caught his eye amid the dark earth and tangled weeds. He bent down, carefully brushing away the damp soil with his gloved hand. What emerged was not a weapon, not a helmet, not the remains of military life, but a small child's shoe. Faded leather cracked by time, its tiny laces knotted loosely as if a hurried hand had tied them moments before fleeing. Daniel stared at it in silence. It did not belong here. This was no place for children, no place for innocence. He lifted the shoe gently as though afraid it might crumble under his touch. The inside was lined with worn fabric, slightly torn at the heel, carrying the faint imprint of a foot that had once filled it with warmth and movement. A sudden weight settled in his chest, heavier than any pack he had ever carried. "Who left you here?" he murmured, his voice swallowed by the wide emptiness around him. He looked across the field, imagining it as it must have been years ago. Smoke thick in the air, screams cutting through gunfire, civilians running blindly as soldiers clashed amid chaos. Somewhere in that storm, a child had lost this shoe, or been forced to leave it behind, or perhaps never returned to claim it. Daniel crouched slowly, placing the shoe beside a broken fence post like a fragile relic. He felt a strange certainty creep into his thoughts. This was not simply debris from war. This was a story incomplete, a small life interrupted. A moment frozen in the aftermath of violence. The wind stirred through the tall grass, carrying with it the faint echo of something long gone. Laughter, perhaps, or a frightened cry that no one had heard in time. And as Daniel remained there holding the tiny shoe in his hands, he realized with quiet unease that this battlefield had not only consumed soldiers, it had swallowed children too. Daniel Hargreaves did not move for a long moment. The child's shoe rested in his hands like something far more fragile than leather and thread. Around him, the battlefield stretched in exhausted silence, as though it too was ashamed of what it had allowed to happen. He turned the shoe slowly, examining its scuffed surface, the faint crease where tiny toes had once pressed forward with every innocent step. There was a faint stain along the side, dried and darkened by time. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing his eyes away from thoughts he did not wish to name. This was not just an object. It was evidence of a life forced into a place it never should have known. He rose slowly and walked forward, scanning the uneven ground. The grass whispered against his legs, bending gently as he moved. And for a moment he imagined another set of smaller footsteps once passing here. Lighter, hurried, afraid. He could almost see the shape of a figure running, stumbling, calling for someone who may never have answered. A few meters ahead, partially hidden beneath tangled roots and broken debris, Daniel noticed fragments of fabric. He knelt again, lifting the cloth carefully. It was once part of a child's coat, thin and faded, patterned faintly with what might have been simple shapes or flowers, now almost erased by rain and dust. His heart tightened. This was no longer coincidence. There had been a child here, perhaps more than one. Daniel looked back toward the shoe, then across the land as far as his eyes could reach. No voices, no signs. Just the quiet aftermath of a tragedy too old for anyone to remember and yet too cruel to ever truly disappear. He imagined a mother searching, a father shouting a name into smoke and confusion, small hands clinging tightly before being torn away by panic and chaos. The thought burned in his mind, refusing to be ignored. "I'll find something," he whispered. "Something that tells me who you were." He gathered the shoe carefully and placed it inside his satchel, not as spoils, but as a promise. A vow that this small life would not remain just another forgotten shadow of war. As Daniel stepped forward again, the wind shifted, carrying an uneasy chill. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant, as if the land itself was waiting for him to uncover the truth it had buried for so long. And somewhere within the stillness, Daniel became certain of one thing. This shoe had not been lost by accident. It had been left behind in fear and flight, in a moment that had changed a child's life forever. A moment that now refused to stay forgotten. Daniel moved deeper into the field, each step guided by an instinct he could not explain. The shoe inside his satchel felt heavier with every passing moment, as though it carried not only a child's presence, but the unspoken weight of an entire forgotten day. The wind brushed softly across his face, and in that faint chill he imagined the same air once touching a frightened child standing here alone, unsure which direction meant safety. He stopped when he noticed a slight dip in the ground, a shallow depression surrounded by trampled grass long since grown back. It looked like a place where someone had fallen or knelt or perhaps hidden. Daniel lowered himself slowly and rested his palm against the earth. It was cool, damp, unyielding, holding its secrets with quiet resolve. Nearby, half concealed by weeds, he spotted something small and pale. He reached for it carefully and lifted it free. A tiny wooden toy. A worn carving of an animal, smoothed by time and little fingers. The paint had almost completely faded, but its shape was unmistakable. A child had played here. Not in joy, not in safety, but in the desperate pause between terror and escape. Daniel's throat tightened. He imagined the moment. Artillery shaking the earth, soldiers shouting, civilians running, and in the midst of that chaos, a child clutching this toy, refusing to let go of the only comfort they knew. A stumble, a fall, a scream lost in noise, and then silence. He placed the toy gently beside the patch of earth and sat back, eyes fixed on the empty horizon. This was no longer just a battlefield. It was a place where innocence had tried to survive and failed. "I don't know your name," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But you were here. And I see you." The wind answered with a soft murmur through the grass, like a sigh drifting across years of forgotten grief. Daniel removed the small shoe from his satchel and set it beside the toy, arranging them as one might lay offerings at a grave. In that small act, a strange sense of purpose washed over him. He was no longer just a soldier walking through ruins. He had become a witness. And as clouds gathered above the field, dimming the fragile daylight, Daniel felt an unshakable certainty settle within him. The story of this child was still unfinished, waiting just beneath the surface of time for someone to listen. Daniel remained where he was as the sky darkened slowly above the field, his gaze fixed on the small arrangement before him. the shoe and the toy resting side by side like fragile remnants of a life that should never have known fear. The quiet felt different now, no longer empty but heavy with the presence of something unseen, as though the land itself remembered a child's final heartbeat. He stood and began to search further, moving cautiously, scanning every uneven rise and hollow in the ground. His eyes followed the subtle signs time had tried to erase. Flattened grass, disturbed soil, a faint irregularity that spoke not of soldiers but of someone small and vulnerable trying to hide. Near the edge of the field, where the grass grew thinner and the earth gave way to scattered stones, Daniel noticed a shallow crease in the terrain, almost like a narrow path once traced by bare, hurried feet. He followed it slowly, his heart tightening with each step. The trail led to a partially collapsed structure, the skeletal remains of what had once been a modest civilian shelter. Its wooden beams leaned at tired angles and scraps of cloth fluttered weakly in the breeze. Daniel stepped inside cautiously, feeling the chill of the shaded interior wrap around him. Against one of the broken walls lay a faded scrap of fabric no larger than his hand. He knelt and lifted it carefully. It was part of a child's garment, soft and thin, perhaps torn in haste, perhaps clutched in panic. A thread still clung to its edge, frayed and fragile. Daniel closed his eyes slowly. He could almost hear it now. A child's quick, uneven breathing, the scrape of knees against dirt, the distant rumble of approaching devastation. He imagined small fingers pressing against a trembling mouth, trying to stay quiet while the world outside collapsed into fire and terror. "No one should have been here," he whispered, his voice hollow. "No one so small." He stepped back outside, looking toward the horizon where the field stretched into gloom. The wind carried a faint chill that felt less like cold and more like a lingering sorrow that refused to leave this place. This was where the child had ended up, here among war and ruin, beside broken dreams and abandoned safety. And in that moment, Daniel knew with aching certainty that this child had not simply lost a shoe. They had been lost by the world. Daniel returned slowly to the center of the field as dusk settled over the land, the horizon dissolving into muted shades of gray and fading gold. The small shoe and the wooden toy still rested where he had placed them, silent witnesses to a story no one had meant to tell. He stood before them now with a heaviness that words could not ease, knowing he was not simply finishing a search but closing the final chapter of a life cut short by a world that offered no mercy. He knelt carefully and removed his helmet, holding it close for a long moment as the cool air touched his face. Around him, the field whispered softly, grass moving in slow waves as though bowing to the memory of someone who had once trembled here, afraid and alone. "I don't know who you were," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "But you mattered. You should have grown. You should have laughed. You should have lived." He gathered a small pile of stones and arranged them gently around the shoe and the toy, forming a simple circle. Not a monument, not a grave, but a sign that someone had seen, someone had cared. Then he placed a thin wooden stake into the ground beside them, carving into it carefully with his knife. "Here rests a child, never meant for war." As he finished, the last light of the day softened the edges of the distant ruins and wrapped the field in quiet reverence. Daniel stood in silence, no longer feeling like a soldier walking through history, but a guardian of a moment no one else would ever remember. He took one final look at the small offering before him and felt a calm settle over his shoulders. Not peace, but purpose. The knowledge that this child, though unknown, would no longer remain unseen. And as Daniel turned and walked away, the wind carried a faint, gentle hush across the grass, as if the field itself had finally released a breath it had held for years. The battlefield remained silent, but the child who had once lost a shoe within it had found someone who refused to forget